Between games like The Evil Within, Alien Isolation and the upcoming Silent Hills, it looks like horror games are back. In the midst of this renaissance of horror, Capcom is bringing back one of the progenitors of the genre with Resident Evil, the remake of the 2002 GameCube game, which itself is a remake of the 1996 original Resident Evil. So how does a 13-year-old game based on a 19-year-old game stack up nowadays? As it turns out, pretty favorably. If you never played the original games, here's what's up. In 1998, reports of horribly mangled corpses found in the outskirts of the midwestern town Raccoon City start piling up. This prompts the town's police special force, STARS, to investigate the nearby Arklay Mountains. After all contact breaks up with Bravo Team, it is your job as a member of Alpha Team to go in and investigate. What you find is a mansion full of the Walking Dead and other horrible creatures. Now it's up to you to escape the mansion by avoiding combat as much as possible, solving puzzles, and finding out what exactly is going on in this place. You have to choose playing as Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine. The choice is more than cosmetic though. Depending on your choice, you will have access to different weapons, find other characters on your way, and also take a slightly different path through your adventure. The difficulty level for both characters also varies. Chris, for example, starts the game without a handgun, has less inventory space, and has to find small keys to unlock certain doors, while Jill has a lockpick for those. While the story itself is nothing revolutionary, it is one of the first instances of environmental storytelling, with a fully developed mansion that tells a story with its eerie mood and written notes you can find, a method that has become increasingly popular for storytelling in games. Resident Evil is the first game of a genre coined survival horror, indicating an emphasis on avoiding combat and managing scarce resources to get by, as opposed to games where you fight your way through countless hordes. The pace of battle is also very deliberate, which further de-emphasizes combat. Every little design decision in the game enforces the survival aspect. To save, you need to find ink ribbons, which are only available in a finite quantity, and typewriters, which are only available at set spots in the mansion. Ammo and healing items are extremely scarce. You can only carry a set amount of items and have to store the rest in boxes found in safe rooms. So smart item management is mandatory. And all of that was further enforced in the GameCube remake this port is based on. Like I said in my Evil Within review, Shinji Mikami, the game's director, is a master at subverting player expectations. And nowhere is that skill more beneficial than in horror games. Even as someone who played a lot of the original Resident Evil. When I first played the remake, it was like a completely different game. Sure, it follows the same story, but the numerous new environments, completely revamped puzzles and new gameplay elements really do a great job of throwing you off your game. Especially if you know where everything was in the original. This game will throw some wrenches in your plans by rearranging enemies and item placements, changing the way you traverse the mansion and implementing some frightening surprises. The best of which are the infamous Crimson Heads. In the original game, once you killed a zombie, again, he stayed dead. In the remake, things are a bit more interesting. If you kill a zombie without shooting his legs off or destroying his head, he stays in the environment, even if you leave the room. You then have the ability to burn him using kerosene and a lighter. If you don't burn him, wait a certain amount of time and then come back, he will turn into a Crimson Head, a more ferocious running zombie that takes a lot of bullets to dispatch. Since kerosene, like everything else in the game, is very scarce, this introduces another gameplay layer you have to take into account. Because you can't burn every zombie, you really have to think twice about which zombies you want to kill and which ones to avoid. Since a regular zombie is easier to deal with than a Crimson Head. So you really should save your kerosene for rooms that you have to visit often. Another added gameplay feature are defensive weapons. If you get grabbed by an enemy, you can perform a defensive maneuver if you have a defensive weapon available. These are either deadly or just damage the enemy, depending on the weapon. Chris uses daggers and grenades while Jill uses daggers and tasers. While grenades might sound like the better deal, they don't explode on their own, meaning you need to trigger them with a bullet, giving Chris another disadvantage. These are the improvements of the 2002 game, but what does this remake bring to the table? Not much on paper. It increases the game's resolution, brings the character models, polygon counts up to current standards, and lets you choose between the original 4:3 aspect ratio or the modern 16:9 standard. The 16:9 aspect ratio is achieved via a pan and scan method, zooming in on the game and scrolling the screen in the direction you move. While it does fill the screen, I prefer the game's original aspect ratio, since I can see everything in the room at once and the game was designed for 4:3. A more controversial addition is the addition of second control method. Resident Evil, since its inception, has always used the so-called tank controls, by which you control a character based on its orientation, as opposed to his position on screen. Meaning if you push up, he will move forward instead of move up on the screen like many other 3D games. If you then push left or right, he will turn in that direction. You could also compare it to controlling RC cars. This control scheme was used to deal with the constantly shifting camera angles necessitated by the pre-rendered backgrounds. While I had to get used to this control scheme the first time I played Resident Evil, it didn't take long, and I didn't have any problems with the controls since. But there seems to be a sizable amount of players that could never get into the controls and couldn't enjoy the Resident Evil games because of them. For these players, Capcom has implemented a control scheme that lets you control the characters like you would in any other 3D game with your analog stick. If you move up, the character moves in that direction. And I have to say I don't really like that control scheme. While it may be easier to use, it does have two problems. First, the character animations aren't made for that kind of control, making them feel weightless and abrupt. With the classic controls, the characters have a certain weight and feel. With the new controls, there's no turn animation for example, which just looks wrong. But the bigger issue is that the game was designed with the tank controls in mind. If you know what you're doing, you can evade zombies, but it takes some skill. With the new controls, you can escape most situations instantly, making most encounters extremely easy, undermining a lot of the survival aspects. Which is not to say I begrudge anyone for using them. If you really can't get into tank controls and want to play the game, sure, go ahead. Just know that you're not playing the game everyone else has played over the years. Luckily the controls are customizable, so everyone can play the way they like. Back in 2002, Resident Evil was one of the most stunningly gorgeous games I have ever seen. And with the modern touch-ups, the game is more beautiful than ever. Taking place in pre-rendered backgrounds, the game can create atmosphere with its lighting and shadow effects like few others. With the exception of the character models, which are clearly over 10-year-old models, made a bit prettier, the game looks good enough to go toe-to-toe with some of the best looking games out there. And the atmosphere is probably the best I have seen in any game ever. Ominous lighting, fog, shadows, everything just fits together, creating an eerie mood that is accentuated by the stellar soundtrack, which is not necessarily something I would listen to in the car, but fits the game like a glove. While the game can be beaten in under 3 hours if you know what you're doing, accept something closer to 10 hours on your first go. It features 3 difficulty levels from the start, with additional difficulty levels and special modes unlockable after you beat it. One mode is so insane, all the enemies in it are invisible. Couple all this with multiple costumes and weapons you can unlock, 2 different characters and multiple endings, and you have a game that is brimming with content, for the price of 1/3 of a new game. With the new additions to the best remake in video game history, the newest version of Resident Evil is the most inviting, most beautiful version of one of the best horror games out there, and is not to be missed if you love the series, horror, or want to know the origin of one of my favorite genres.